Good day, flight simmers. Today we're going to do a flight with the King Air 350i, and we're going to fly from Buffalo Niagara International to Elmira Corning Regional using VOR navigation. There's a little information there on the King Air 350i if you want to pause it. So we use a little nav map to create a flight plan. There's other videos I've made on how to create a flight plan with a little nav map. If you hold your mouse over the airport, you can get the information on it. There's the airport there. And I basically selected a couple VOR stations to use in the flight plan. So there's a little information on the definition of a VOR. You can pause for that if you want. And they broadcast in Morse code. Give you a second to read that. Okay, and they also have a rose compass around them. So there's three types of VOR navigation stations. Just a basic VOR, VOR-DME, which is for distance measuring, and the King Air does have the capability to pick up that DME. So we're going to be getting that information during the flight. FORTAC is for military. You can use those VORs, but they have their own separate channels that you can't access. So the symbols are slightly different for the three different types of VORs. This is the runway we're going to be flying to. Runway 6 we're going to land on, and we're going to get the frequency. So there's the VOR symbol. So basic VOR without DME is just a hexagonal shape with a dot in the center. If it's got a box around it in little nav map, it's going to have DME, and the military ones have the bars on the corners, three sides of the hexagonal. You can click those waypoints on and off by just using your toolbar up above. So they'll go on and off if you click on them. So back on again. So a radial is a word that's used to refer to the actual line or radial emanating from the VOR. So if we're flying towards that, we are going to be going on a bearing towards the VOR, not out from the VOR on a radio. So I'm just going to load that flight plan right now from little nav map. Just go to Microsoft Flight Sim and call up the flight plan in my directory, and that was exported to Microsoft Flight Sim, and now I've clicked on it. So it's now in the aircraft, that flight plan.
Takeoff runway tree 2 Nasser 616.
So there's a little performance information on the King Air. So we need a runway of 3,300 feet for takeoff. So I'm just going to check a few things here before we go. Just turn some lights on overhead here. Floodlights and windshield wipers because it's raining right now. So if it's at night, you're definitely going to want to be turning this stuff on. You won't be able to see what you're doing very well. So there's the wipers, little information there on your flap speeds, etc. Okay, I'm just shutting off that warning, which was because the parking brake's on right now. So I'm just going to check a few things here, check our lights. Those are operable, so you can turn them on and off. So turn the taxi light off and the other lights on as appropriate. The auto feather switch to arm doesn't work. It's inoperable. So if you're wondering about that in the checklist, it's done for you. So there's your primary flight display, your multifunctional, and your primary flight display 2. So PFD1 we'll be using most of the time. Copilot uses the other one. So I've got VOR1 up up on the screen here, and I'm setting on the split screen on the right, you can see VOR1. I'm setting the course heading CRS1 to 106 magnetic for VOR1 to the VOR-GEE. That's the first one we're flying to. And then I'm going to go over to the primary flight display for the co-pilot side and set the course heading for VOR2. So I've set that on VOR2 there. That's a split screen you can bring up just by touching the center and going to your flight plan, and you'll be able to see your nav buttons that you can hit. So I'm just setting the course heading 2 now to 157 magnetic for VOR-ULW, which is our second VOR we're going to head to. So I also have to program the frequencies for these VORs. So nav1 frequency, you click that button. So we hit the touch screen in the middle on the left, and it'll bring up these screens on the right in your split screen. So I'm now setting the nav frequency for the first VOR, which is Gulf Echo Echo, to 108.20. I'm also going to set the standby frequency for runway 06, which is 109.10 or 10 megahertz. So I'm going to set that as a standby frequency. So when we get to Elmira Corning Regional, I'll be able to switch back to nav1 and VOR1, and I'll be able to get the localizer for that runway. So there's what I've done. So now we have VOR1 and VOR2. We have their frequencies and their course headings set. I'll turn on the bearing pointers once we're flying, and you'll see in the primary flight display there, just below on either side of the compass, you'll see nav1 and nav2, and you'll be able to see our distance from those VORs. So because it's a VOR-DME, and this aircraft can measure the distance for us, which is nice to have. So there's an auxiliary screen that has additional information. There's your automatic flight control right here. So we'll be using these buttons here to set the autopilot, flight director, yaw damper, nav. And right now I'm setting the vertical speed ahead of time and to climb. So I went to the vertical speed button. Also have to set the altitude. So I set the altitude to 4,000 for the flight plan. So there's the flight plan. That's like a GPS flight plan, but we're actually going to follow a bearing towards that VOR station, the first one, because we have VOR1 set, you can see. So here's a takeoff checklist. Flaps at 20 for takeoff, release your brakes, and there's your V1 VR rotated around 110 knots. There's your V2, and pitch up at about 10-15 degrees. Retract your landing gear after you have a good rate of climb, and also bring up your flaps. So try and maintain 140 knots if you can. And you want to check your lights, annunciator lights, and engine instruments.
Buffalo departure Nasser 616.
So there's the autopilot, the yaw damper,
climbing 4,000 feet.
vertical speed, just checking. The nav's on. So right now we're on autopilot, and the aircraft should turn and head towards VOR-1 VOR-1 at a heading of 106 magnetic, which is what I entered in CRS1 for the course heading. So the frequency was 108.20 for that VOR station, and it's 42 nautical miles away. And once I get these bearing pointers on, you'll be able to see in the primary flight display on either side of the compass, you'll see how far we are. The DME will kick in and give us some information. That would be nice to have. So right now you can double check your instruments, make sure your props are okay, your torque, your fuel. Just doesn't hurt to. Right now I'm just checking the flight plan there. I clicked on it and I've kind of edited. You can see the flight plan on the left there. I've kind of edited the video so it doesn't run too long. Because the flight's actually, this would have taken around an hour, so I've shortened it. But right now we're coming up to VOR-1, which is Gulf Echo Echo VOR station. And as we approach it, I'm going to, on the split screen there on your left of the primary flight display, I'm going to switch to VOR-2, because in VOR-2 I have programmed in 157 magnetic on the course that we're going to take. It's a Victor 147 airway, and the frequency is 109.65, so it'll pick up and head towards that course heading, and it'll pick up that frequency. So here's some things to check while you're cruising in your checklist, so you can go through those. So I switched to VOR-2 there. So basically I'm just monitoring things, make sure we're following that course heading now for VOR-2 on Victor 147 airway. So you can see the aircraft is turning now, and I'm just monitoring my airspeed, my altitude, and my RPMs on the props. You can check things like your oil pressure and temperature, etc. on your multifunctional display screen in the middle. So right now I'm just checking to make sure our speed is okay here and our altitude. And now you can see the bearing pointers just below on either side of the compass, because I have them turned on now. So now we can see how far away we are from the VOR stations that we have in our flight plan. So this is tracking right now on almost a GPS route on the MFD. Now when I get to VOR-2, which is Uniform Lima Whiskey, I am going to go back to VOR-1 on the split screen there in the primary flight display, and once I hit VOR-1 I'm also going to have to go to nav1 standby and make that active. So I have to go to nav1 and I have to make the frequency for the standby frequency of 109.10 megahertz for runway 06. I have to make that the active frequency for nav1. So right now I'm just checking the propellers. You can engine condition with these levers, and you can also cut back with your prop levers and, you know, reduce your RPMs. So right now the autopilot's flying the aircraft. So take a little look at inside at the back there, our passengers happily sitting. We've got a full load here, even though they don't show up. 8 passengers, 2 club configuration. So unfortunately they don't have passengers showing up in these views. Here's a fuse panel on your right, a large one. And there's your fuel gauges. Now there's a ELTS. You can actually activate that. It's operational, but that's for to send out an emergency distress in case of an accident. It'll automatically deploy on impact. So you can pause that if you wanted to read what it said. So these most of these little switches are active. You can actually do things with them, and if you do stuff with them that you shouldn't, you may find you shut your engines down or cause issues. Alrighty, back to our primary flight display. So the bearing pointers turned on, like I said, and they're showing up in primary flight display. So the primary flight display options right now, like I said, when I get to VOR2, I'm going to switch to VOR1 again, and I'm going to activate the standby frequency for nav1. So here's a descent checklist. You're checking out the weather. Make sure your altimeter is set. You hit B on your keyboard to set your barometric pressure. Auto feather doesn't work. Get your speed around 180. Watch your torque. 1600 RPMs is good. You want your flaps and landing gear. Your flaps are up right now, and you want to be ready as we get closer to put down your landing gear and flaps. So there's a good look at our King Air, motoring along nicely. I have the heads-up display turned on outside, so when I'm outside I can monitor what's going on and see if there's any issues. So right now you can see everything looks good. We're doing 213 knots roughly. So before GPS, before VOR GPS came along, VOR stations were the way aircraft navigated. And they're still maintaining a lot of these VOR stations because in case of issues with GPS, they're a backup system that pilots will be able to use. So right now I'm scrolling vertical speed, and I can hit VS and scroll it. That little wheel, you scroll it up, you can see down. You have to scroll up on the wheel with your mouse, and you'll start descending. So I want to get my altitude down because we're getting close to the airport. So very shortly I'm just going to switch now to VOR1 and change the nav 1 frequency to standby and make it active. So the frequency of 109.10 will be like a localizer frequency. So we're not going to be doing a ILS landing, but I want to still pick up the localizer because it will line us up perfectly with the runway. And then I'll just use a manual landing. I'll take autopilot off. So I'll descend, but I'll leave autopilot on just to line me up with the runway. So here I didn't need to select a course because the localizer will actually send out a signal to line the aircraft up. So here's an approach checklist. Landing lights on. Check your fuel. Anti-ice as required. Try and get your speed around 150 knots. flaps set. And now as we get closer, we're going to have flaps full. And turn off the autopilot. Landing gear down, check. And you can put on reverse thrust if you want. This plane does have reverse thrust. You may have it programmed in. So you can see the localizer lined us up really nicely with the runway. And now I'm just going to have to do a manual approach and landing, coming in at around 3 degrees on a slope of 3 degrees. Make sure you check your barometric pressure, have it accurate so your altitude is okay. So landing gear down, full flaps. Try and get your speed down to around 100 to 105 for landing. Okay, so the autopilot took us all the way there on a VOR navigational course. So the King Air works really nicely for VOR flights if you want to try them. It's good if there's no ILS runway and it's just a localizer. That's basically what this would be, using VOR stations and a localizer frequency to line yourself up with the runway. So there's our taxi to ramp checklist. Get your taxi lights on. Landing lights off, anti-ice off, and you're supposed to go speed of 20 knots. The elevator trim, you can take off the setting if you had it on. Your avionics radio, you want to set that so you can talk to ATC. So we're just going to go up here to general parking and we'll shut it down using our checklist. So I'm just going to turn off that warning for the parking brake, which is on.
Elmira Ground Nasser 616 request taxi to parking. Taxiing to general aviation parking using taxiway Delta Charlie Nasser 616.
Alright, got a little nav map up again. I had it off for most of the flight, but I like it when you land. You can actually see where you're going and find your way to a specific gate or parking spot. And those little blue arrows, they are turned on in your options settings. When you first start up Microsoft Flight Sim, you can go into options and assistance, and you can have those come on. So if you don't know your way around these airports, it's not quite as important now that you have a little nav map. Here we go. We got some directions here. I find Microsoft Flight Sim takes you a little too close to these people with the propeller spinning. So now we're going to do a shutdown. You want to get your parking brake on so it doesn't roll into this guy. Alrighty, so let's just go through that checklist. Throttle to idle, auto feather off, flight director off, avionics switch off, taxi lights off. You want your pitot off, fuel conditioner lever to cut off, propeller feather beacon off, so your panel light off, your battery switch off when you get to a certain level there. I'm just shutting these things down. So Microsoft does have a checklist that if you have a hard time finding some of these switches, they do have a checklist that if you have it on assist, it'll show you where these things are. They'll light up in blue. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me on this VOR flight. Much appreciated. Give me a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe. And I'll catch you next time, Flight Simmers.